Hi and welcome to my channel. It's been about 18 months since I got my lovely old Nikon F4 and I'm going to give you a kind of a long-term update on how I'm enjoying using it. Also, I've got a bit fed up recently with always using the same developers, and I thought I would test something I'd never tried before for you, and that will be the amazing, well, the much vaunted Pyrocat HD. Let's get into it. So, last weekend I took my Nikon F4, my Nikon D800 and my iPhone and gimbal to shoot some nice cinematic B-roll to Teddington Lock on the Thames, and it was a lovely sunny day and there was supposed to be a great introduction shot by me to camera from the banks of the Thames, and the sound utterly screwed up. I didn't get any sound at all because I used a cheap, I think it was about £15 plug-in radio mic unit for the iPhone, and it just basically didn't work apart from one shot, so I've got to look into that, but it really serves me right for cheaping out on that. Firstly, my loadout of lenses for this trip. Wide angle duty was taken by my absolutely lovely 24mm f2.8 Nikon. I love 24mm as a focal length for all kinds of walkabout work, and in fact I'm using it for my indoor headshots on my Panasonic Lumix G85 for pretty much everything video wise these days, so it's a great lens on micro four thirds too. My 50mm standard lens for this trip was the 50mm f1.8 E series Pancake, which is actually one of my favourite Nikon 50mm lenses. It's not AF, but it is nice and sharp and incredibly small. And thirdly, I was taking my 85mm f1.4 Samyang. Now the wonderful thing about the f1.4 Samyang when it's paired with the Nikon F4 is that the F4's 0.008 of a second top speed means you can shoot pretty much wide open in quite bright sun. So the elephant in the room is that the F4 is a bit of a chunky monkey. It's a little bit on the heavy side, especially with the MB21 battery pack, which is part of the, I think it's the F4S, which is mine. However, it really sits beautifully in the hands and it feels like it's sort of carved from a solid block of Nikonium or something. It just feels wonderful, and compared even to the D800, which is a pro-level DSLR and also sits beautifully in the hands, it just feels so much more luxurious. The D800 really feels a little bit more plasticky, which is a bit of a shame because I really do love the D800 as well in its own way. But the F4 is really quite special. The other thing that's really quite special is the accuracy of the F4's metering. I use mostly aperture priority, and I use the exposure compensation dial, which is very, very clear and very, very easy to use on the F4. And I see no reason really ever to take this camera off of aperture priority. It's just like a point and shoot camera, and when you consider that the autofocus, admittedly with one focusing point, is really quite fast, and if you're using fairly modern lenses with it, and the great advantage of course is that it will take quite modern lenses, you really don't need to think about using the F4 that much. It's a very, very instinctive camera. It sounds wonderful. The shutter sound is almost musical. It's absolutely beautiful. I don't need to wax purple in my prose about it, but it's just really nice. And even the sound of the wind back, when you're auto winding back 36 exposure film, is a beautiful silky hum. The whole thing is an absolute pleasure to use, even down to taking the prism head off so that you can use low angles, and I do that quite often. It's just such a joy. Okay, if I'm going to be super nitpicky about the F4, 18 months into using it, a couple of little things maybe are a bit irritating. One being the fact that absolutely every control has a locking button. Now, I think that's fantastic on most of the controls, but some of them you think, really, do I need that? I find the double action for selecting wind back a little fiddly to use compared to, say, the old F801 that I used to use, which was much simpler. That is really about all I can criticise. That and the shutter release when you're using the vertical grip is very, very sensitive, and if you then go back to horizontal, you will probably accidentally use the heel of your hand and shoot off some images that you don't want to, because it really is very, very sensitive. I would have preferred that there was a deeper collar around it so that you could not so easily actuate it. But that's such a nitpicking series of things. It is truly about the best professional 35mm camera I have ever used. So, on to Teddington Lock, and on to talking about the film I was using, and more importantly, the developer I was using. As we're now technically in summer, I am using some of my stash of Ilford FP4 Plus, and as a nice change, I thought I would get some Pyrocat HD. I've heard great things about Pyrocat HD, a tanning developer, and I thought I would have a go with it. I looked at the massive development chart and I rated the FP4 at standard 125 box speed and shot from there. Let's have a look at Teddington Lock.
Well, here I am at the end of a walk at the Anglers at Teddington Lock for a nice pint in a wobbly glass, and it will be home to develop and sort out what we've taken. Cheers.
Okay, I really got the Pyrocat HD for use with the large format negatives, but I thought I'd got to start somewhere. So mixing up the chemicals really wasn't that difficult. It's one part of part A, one part of part B to 100 millilitres of water. Really simple to work out, and in fact I used the calculator on the massive dev chart for that. As I said earlier, rated the Ilford FP4 Plus at box speed, which meant I had a 20-minute development with 1 minute initial agitation and then 10 seconds every 3 minutes. I was a little bit dubious about this development time, and actually when I took the negatives out of the wash, I was slightly surprised at how thin they were. I'm very used to the negative quality that the metering in the Nikon F4 delivers, and this really wasn't quite what I was expecting. There was nothing unscannable, or if I wanted to print it, unprintable there. But I will say the negatives were thinner than I would have expected, with less shadow detail. So in fact, I think they weren't making box speed. I would be surprised if they were making 100 ISO, possibly even 80 ISO. So for future experimentation, that's the way I'm going to go. I'm going to rate FP4 at about 80 ISO and see where I go from there. However, the images were quite acceptable. There's really quite a fine grain and lots of detail. Anyway, I'll show you those images. Okay, so I'm going to put my initial slight disappointment at Pyrocat HD down to a bit of over-optimism, perhaps on the massive dev chart, and perhaps some pilot error on my part. I was pretty careful with the chemical mixing, and I was very careful with the development time, temperatures, a water pre-wash, and no acid stop bath between the developer and fixer. But everybody else really seems to like Pyrocat HD, and I'm going to keep persisting with it, and I'll try it next, I think, on some roll film. But that is for another episode coming up shortly. Anyway, if you've enjoyed this episode, then perhaps you'll hit the like button. And if you've really enjoyed it, perhaps you'll think about subscribing. And if you want to support the channel more, you can have a look at my Patreon page. There's all kinds of interesting things coming up on there, and we've got lots of things coming up for the summer. And I've got to go back into the workshop and do some more work on the 10-8 camera, which is beginning to progress now. Anyway, until I see you again, take care of yourselves and keep taking pictures.